So this is gonna be a new series on this channel. This is gonna be mainly about VGC. Um, and so yeah, it's gonna be uh something that I've been planning on doing for a while. Just wanted to kind of flesh a lot of things out first before I try to come out with a series. So yeah, this is gonna be mainly about VGC formats, particularly the main formats that they play at events, whether they be, you know, locals or um, league challenges or league cups or regionals, etc. So mainly going to be covering those formats. Right. So um, just to kind of give a short introduction to my experience with VGC, I've been playing. I started playing VGC in about 2019, 2018, 2019, and um, yeah, generally just kind of uh took kind of what I learned from competitive Pokemon playing Pokemon competitive Pokemon before starting to play VGC, kind of just applied it to VGC. Also, just kind of following trends of kind of VGC teams in general and stuff like that. That's kind of how I started. I was always kind of like an avant-garde Pokemon player, so I never really took a uh, trendy or kind of flavor of the month sort of take to VGC. I always try to innovate and sort of yeah, kind of make my own way. You want to call it that with VGC, and so yeah, that's generally how I approach VGC, and yeah, it was very fun and very entertaining to instead of trying to play Pokemon my own way, really try to understand what Pokemon's trying to accomplish with VGC in general. And so um yeah, that's kind of how I started and played pretty consistently since then. I haven't really taken many breaks. And so I've been able to follow the VGC format, especially in this point of time in VGC, where it's very pretty much still in its infancy for the most part. There's not a lot of resources available for new players. Generally, if you're gonna get into VGC, it's because you're either just extremely passionate about gaming in general, and you just kind of just soak in all the information really quickly and just go buy a Switch and then make your teams, or you're like part of a friend group of people who play Pokemon, and someone in the friend group helps you get into VGC, right? So generally, VGC is still kind of very green and very much has a lot of room for innovation and a lot of room for investigation. So that's kind of what this series is going to be about. And yeah, if you've been watching my TCG videos, you know that um, I'm very much interested in the design and the kind of angles that Pokemon is trying to take. And so that's what this is going to be about. This is going to be no different, right? So um, yeah, um, so for this first video, I want to just first obviously give that introduction, and also this video is going to be about um, VGC categories, not VGC categories, more um, Pokemon categories, right? Sort of to give an introduction for either new players, who want to get into competitive Pokemon, intrepid players who really like to investigate Pokemon, and also for players of all skill levels. Whether you be novice, intermediate, advanced, pro, whatever you want to call yourself, competitive, casual, competitive, whatever, right? To sort of contribute to the voice of trying to um, add more resources into the hands of players, right? So yeah, this is what this video is going to be about. I'm going to cover categories of Pokemon, and then I'm going to cover sort of my team I'm playing for VGC format. Right. So yeah, so ran into a bit of technical difficulties, but I think they're sorted out now. So I'm going to uh yeah continue where I left off. So before we get into categories, just gonna show kind of my Scarlet game. So if you know anything about uh symbols in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, you know that all those symbols mean that those boxes are full, right? So Pokemon is not just like a hobby for me, something that I uh endeavor to be the best at, quite frankly. And so yeah, it's quite a grueling and time consuming activity, but it's definitely very rewarding. And so yeah, I don't uh wish for a second. I don't wish for a single uh second of my time playing this game back. I yeah, I enjoy playing the game a lot. And so yeah, it's not just something I just do for my friends, or something I just do for fun, or something to make money. Pokemon is something I enjoy a lot, and so yeah, right. So yeah, just to kind of get that out of the way, right? Um, so yeah, uh, so with that out of the way, kind of want to explain sort of what I've been working on in particular with um VGC recently. So VGC, I mean, since I'm a kid, I've always uh always strive to learn more about Pokemon. That was something that's been very important to my life, right? And so even as a kid, like I can still, you know, pull up, you know, notebooks I have full of, you know, format related stuff. Whether it be stuff from like black and white formats, or from 6v6 singles, from like Sun and Moon and X and Y. I can always pull up those and sort of reminisce on my journey throughout Pokemon, right? And so, yeah, when I approached VGC, it was no different, right? I didn't approach VGC because I heard, that you can win, you know, $7,500 if you come first place at a regional, right? I got into VGC as a continued quest to learn more about Pokemon, right? And so yeah, uh, it's not just something I just kind of look through and just come up with conclusions just to share with people. Pokemon is my life, right? And so it's yeah, very important that not only I have my shit organized, if you want to put it like that, but that I also, share that information with the community, so that people can't just call me some selfish guy who just loves playing Pokemon. So And to go on a sort of rant here, uh, that's kind of where I find Pokemon, in this day and age, right? Pokemon has not been in good hands for the last 5 years, and since Pokemon has moved from handheld games to consoles, right? And that signified it's it's sort of entering into the mainstream of competitive gaming, or what's colloquially known as esports, right? Um, and even before then, Pokemon wasn't really in good hands. I want to kind of get into a lot of things in this video, and this is probably gonna go on for a long time, and it's gonna be pretty information dense. So kind of prepare for that. If you need like a drink, something to eat, um, now's the time to go and get that. But yeah, um, it's Pokemon has kind of developed a reputation for being pay to win, basically, right? People, who are very ignorant about gaming would probably lump a game like Pokemon and its competitive scene into games like, like Honkai Star Rail or something like that, where you essentially just either you're very well connected with people who are very affluent in the game, right? So you can get stuff very easily, or you basically just take what's good at the moment and you just abuse it for whether it be points or for placings at events, right? And um, I took I didn't really go into that route in terms of trying to just win money in Pokemon basically through abusing meta. I obviously focused on my life, went to school, did my job, which is lifeguarding, right? And you know just sort of played Pokemon on the side, right? Um, Even though obviously, like I've said, Pokemon is my life pretty much, right? Um, and yeah, right. I didn't do that route, and so um, I always knew, obviously, because of how much time I put into Pokemon, that it wasn't true. That you know, even being part of the community, like I was always I was a black sheep in the community because you know people who are quote unquote talented, right, are topping events after events back to back to back, and then I'm also in that category of talented players because people can tell that I'm not just trying to win money. I'm actually like a Pokemon player, right? And they're just very baffled that I don't choose to um win events, quite frankly, right? Um, so yeah, and I just could have left people to their own devices. I didn't try to become that top player in the sense of winning events, right? So I can have my voice heard ultimately. I just sort of played my game, right? And I figured that Pokemon would be able to handle their competitive scene, without a lot of help, right? Because frankly, they're just not getting a lot of help. These top players, like to pretty much, instead of being grateful that Pokemon is giving them a chance to really show their skills, they try to twist Pokemon's arms and get Pokemon to do things that they want Pokemon to do, right? And ultimately, like I said, watching from an ivory tower, basically, which means that I'm just sort of oh, insulated from all the drama and conflict. I was like, well, I was always knew that Pokemon would never do the things that people are asking them to do, right? And so I largely kept silent for uh for the last 5 or 7 years since I've been playing TCG and VGC pretty avidly, right? As a master, at least, right? And so, um, yeah, it got to the point where eventually I did want to, become that player who was top in events, having my voice heard, etc. And I really put a lot of time and effort into the game, VGC and TCG. And I, the funny thing is actually kind of ironic because I played TCG more than I played VGC, but it's pretty ironic that in the times that I put a lot of time and effort into getting good at both VGC and TCG, ironically enough, despite my more having more experience in the TCG, I actually got more results from VGC than TCG. Right? Playing on ladders, particularly the you know um ladders that you can play on the game on Scarlet and Violet, right? I peaked like 3K, 4K, right? So it was like, wow, right? In a game that I wasn't really honestly even taking seriously, right? And the reason why I sort of bring that up is because um generally in um in VGC there's largely a culture of um there's largely a culture of just frankly not playing the game, right? So again, right, watching from the ivory tower of me, who's an avid Pokemon player, right, playing the game, right, to its wholeness, right. As you can see, full boxes, right. I'm like, okay, well, hey, right, you guys may not, play, the game as much as I do, but there must somehow be some sort of, thought process, rationale, planning that they do to, come up with all the teams they come up with. And largely that's just completely absent because the reason why I came to this conclusion is because all these players that, put up results and stuff like that largely don't, report on their process, right? So that's indicative of a lot of things, basically, right? Not to get too much into that, right? So, yeah. So not only do they completely circumvent the process of even playing the game, right? They also play in testing groups, right? So they have a lot of people to bounce ideas off of. And even with all that, me just playing the game myself, I was able to not only formulate strategies to win, but also um, build a very large collection of teams um, just solely through just playing the game, basically. Whereas, which I'll get into, people don't really do, right? So, yeah, the reason why I find it very ironic that somehow I got more success in VGC than TCG is because in TCG, there's no shortcuts, right? You have to buy the cards or pull the cards, and you have to learn the rules. You have to have a good grasp on what the decks you're playing do, and then you have to win with your win condition, right? In VGC, there's no barrier of entry. All you have to do is own a Switch, and you don't even have to own a Switch. You can just own a copy of the game and just maybe get a friend's Switch and just bring it to an event, right? And then that's it. because what people do is they don't play the game. They just basically modify their console, and then they use Pokemon generators, which is basically software that lets you manipulate your save file so that you can basically uh, insert Pokemon into the game, right? And they make teams that way, right? Perfect Pokemon with like perfect IVs, right? And right? And then they play, basically, right? So there's no, oh, I like this Pokemon, oh, this Pokemon's cool. It's literally just get a game copy, generate Pokemon, and just play the ladder, right? And there's no barrier for that in VGC, right? Pokemon is basically buckled and just let people do this, right? And so we get this situation where it seems like there's a lot of growth in the game, right? There's a lot of, active people in the community, and that the game is, you know, um, flourishing, right? And bustling, right? And that's just not true, right? It's basically just an illusion, right? Like, there's no bustling in the community. There's no, flourishing of the community. The community is largely dormant, and yeah, there needs to be a way bigger effort from people who actually care about Pokemon in the sense of they want the game to thrive and you know continue, right? Because yeah, the people whose hands it is in right now are not doing that, right? And I don't want to sit here and try to be all doom and gloom and try to like make people lose hope that Pokemon is not gonna get better game and stuff like that. I'm just stating what is basically right. This is my observation. I'm very active in the Pokemon community, and so I'm not just taking this stuff out of thin air. I'm not taking this stuff out of nowhere. I'm just speaking on what I've seen, basically, right? And so yeah, right. That's largely what's prompting this um um series is that basically I think I've thoroughly covered TCG, and I want to thoroughly cover VGC in tandem with TCG as well now. Basically, just to for a lot of reasons. To flex because quite frankly, um, there's nobody in the community that can flex, or nobody in the community that can quite frankly um flex in the way that I'm gonna flex. And yeah, I'll put that challenge out there openly. There is nobody that can really flex like this. Um, and um, to basically um sort of not leave stones unturned. Really cover my bases in these Pokemon, and because there's this culture of content creation in esports, particular, where people kind of just play their game and then they don't really get into other aspects of the game, or they kind of just plateau, basically, right? So that's the second reason. Third reason is because um yeah, I feel like I have something to prove, honestly. And so I'm not going to just stick to my comfort zone. I'm going to step out of my comfort zone, and I'm going to prove that I can, handle it, basically, right? So yeah, those are the three main reasons, right? And I can get into a lot more reasons, but I just want to just put those reasons out there, kind of for people's consideration, right? So yeah, that rant's over. And I'm just gonna get into the topic of this video, which is categories of Pokemon and um yeah, the team that I'm playing for VGC right now, right? which is listed here, right? So yeah, so again, like I said, um, I've researched Pokemon for many years now, and so this is sort of just a combination of all that research. So don't take this more as I don't know, if like if you want to put it in a more academic way, like a scientific paper being published or something like that. This is more of a, like I said, sort of like an introduction to the series I'm going to be doing on this channel, right? So, yeah, um, Pokemon can be categorized. If you want to categorize them in terms of their competitive viability, they can be categorized into four basic categories. Right. I don't want to get into kind of subcategories. I just want to kind of focus on basic categories that you would put Pokemon into. Right. So they can be categorized into four basic categories: Meta Pokemon, uh, Wall Breakers, Sweepers, and Utilities. Right. So I'll explain these four categories. Right. So Meta Pokemon um, are Pokemon that you're generally going to build around. Right. So you know, Pokemon. I'm more well versed in TCG. Um, even though I've been playing it for shorter, it's just since it's more of a structured game, it's easier to understand. Um, Whereas Pokemon is a more abstract game. So, um, meta Pokemon generally in trading card games, right, are um generally Pokemon that make up an archetype, right? So they're like the core of an archetype, right? So, for example, a card like Pidgeotty X, if you're familiar with the current standard format for a trading card game, um, wouldn't be categorized as an archetype. It'd be more of like something like, well, if you want to compare it to the game, like a utility Pokemon, right? It's not a Pokemon you're gonna build around, right? Um, Pokemon like um, Terapagos would be an example. Terapagos EX would be an example of a meta Pokemon, a Pokemon you can build around, right? And so the game is no different, right? Um, there are meta Pokemon in uh the game as well, right? So generally, meta Pokemon are going to be Pokemon you're going to build around, right? So the reason why you build around them is because, contrary to like the TCG, where there's a very clear hierarchy of what Pokemon are stronger than others, right? Like you wouldn't play like a Butterfree card over like a Charizard EX from Obsidian Flames, right? Um, right. So in TCG, where there's a very clear hierarchy, right, it's very much easier to understand. But in um the game, right, there's also a hierarchy of Pokemon too, but it's just a little less easier to understand because generally, um, it's not like TCG where you just have your HP or your retreat costs and then your attack costs, right? This is Pokemon are kind of just categorized into having six stats, the HP, right? Attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed, right? And then there's just configurations of those stats, right? So it's kind of harder to understand meta Pokemon from that perspective compared to something like TCG, where there's a very clear hierarchy of um, Pokemon, right? So the reason why meta Pokemon are categorized as such is because uh, they have like very solid stat lines, and they are um, unpredictable generally. They can be built in a lot of ways, which is why they're meta, right? You can build them in a certain way, configure them in a certain way, and then build other Pokemon around them, right? Um, and they have type in combinations, or if there's monotype, they have a type that is easy to build around, right? So generally, meta Pokemon will be like water, fire, grass, dragon, ground, rock, and like steel, right? And you can kind of see that here, right? Like you have Arcanine here, fire, Blaziken, fire, right? And like Dragapult, fire, right? Dragon, right? And then they have their other typings, which kind of complements their uh complement their primary, meta typing, if you want to call it that, right? So, um, yeah, so those are meta Pokemon. They have solid stats. Generally are fire, grass, water, etc. Right? Very basic kind of type, right? And they can be configured in ways that you can build around them, right? So yeah, that's meta Pokemon, right? And so I've classified sort of the meta Pokemon I've been using throughout Scarlet and Violet into this box, right? And these are generally the meta Pokemon that I've been using, right? Um, so yeah, those are meta Pokemon, right? I'm not gonna get into like my favorites or anything or pick any favorites right here. I'm just going to sort of, maybe I'll leave that in for like another video, but maybe covering, sort of teams that I've been playing throughout this um VGC formats, right? But yeah, generally these are the meta Pokemon that I've been using. Pokemon that are categorized as meta Pokemon, right? And so yeah, um, that's meta Pokemon, right? The next category of Pokemon are wall breakers, right? So before I even get into wall breakers, I've already shown the next category is like sweepers, right? Here, right? Sweepers, right? And you could actually contrast wall breakers and sweepers, right? Wall breakers, if you wanted to put them in like trading card game terms, wall breakers would be like Pokemon that are designed to counter other Pokemon, right? So there are Pokemon like, for example, if you want to use the future archetype, in the trading card game, right? Future has a lot of Pokemon that are designed to beat certain very popular Pokemon, right? So, for example, Iron Hands, right, can one shot a Pidgeot EX, right? Or Iron Leaves can one shot a Charizard EX, right? So those would be like what would be like wall breakers in the game, right? So wall breakers are, and that's actually not even really a good um explanation for wall breakers. Um, in contrast to wall breakers would be like more control style Pokemon, and then sweepers would be more like combo type Pokemon, right? So for wall breakers, there's not really a lot of setup. They set up, they come onto the board, and then they are immediately threats, right? Whether it be because, and then generally because they're threats generally because they can stop certain strategies from flourishing, basically, right? So if you know anything about stats in Pokemon, right? You know that you have your base stat, right? which is I don't have my cursor here. Maybe I can. I don't think I can enable my cursor, but you have like your base stats, like special attack, for example, right? Um, right, and it's a stat value, right? So, for example, Rotom's, I think Rotom's base special attack is 105, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and so you'd have your base stat, which is 105, and then it could be amplified by what's called effort values, right? So effort values, for example, for a level 100 Pokemon, every 4 effort values you put into a stat increases your stat by 1, right? And then up to a maximum of 252, right? And for a level 50 Pokemon, the first 8 EV effort values give 1 stat, and then after that, every 4 gives 1 stat, right? And then you have natures as well, right? So um, this guy is mild by nature. This Rotom is mild by nature, but I gave it a modest mint, and so now its nature is modest, right? And so yeah, right. Um, and so basically, um, if you wanted to, you could just like in trading card games, where if you wanted to, you don't necessarily have to make a all out board that does a lot of damage. You can just basically what would be the Pokemon equivalent would be instead of, for example, with this Rotom that has 252 special attack and a modest nature, which increases its special attack and lowers its attack, you could take something and you could put 252 into its defense, for example, and then put 252 into its HP, right? Thus making basically what would be the equivalent of like a control style Pokemon, right? And that's what wall breakers are designed to counter, right? So wall breakers basically they are designed to prevent those Pokemon from being like unstoppable. Basically, that's the best way to put it. So yeah, um, that's the category of Pokemon like wall breakers, and generally they're categorized as by having a way to really break through a wall, which is generally what high defense Pokemon are called in high defense Pokemon are called in like competitive Pokemon. They're called walls, right? So what beats a wall would be a wall breaker, right? So that's kind of the angle that wall breakers take, right? And so yeah, so wall breakers are categorized as just being able to dish out very very high amounts of damage in a very efficient manner, right? Generally with drawbacks usually, right? So you take a Pokemon like Palafin, right? Um, and it's like um, Palafin when it's in its zero form has like 90 attack or something like that, right? But then when it transforms into its hero form, it has 160, right? So and then it gets attacks like Wave Crash, Jet Punch, right? So right, which have very high base powers and very powerful effects, right? But the drawback is that you have to set up the Palafin, right? So you have to switch it out and then switch it back in, and then it becomes a hero form, right? So wall breakers are not without their um, drawbacks, and just like walls are not without their drawbacks too, right? So those are wall breakers, right? Generally categorized as wall breakers in competitive Pokemon, right? Next is sweepers. Sweepers I would categorize as like combo style Pokemon, right? So a pretty popular or strong, rather, pretty strong combo deck in Pokemon trading card game right now is Chempao Baxcalibur, right? And Chempao Baxcalibur is very strong as a combo deck because once it sets up, you have your Baxcalibur, which can put as many energies as you want water energies that you want into play on your turn, and then Chimpa, which can attack with any amount of water energies, with but it needs two minimum, right? And so yeah, sweepers are kind of similar. That once they set up, they can pretty much like devastate your opponent, right? So that's kind of how sweepers are. And this is not supposed to be here. This is not supposed to be here. Right. So yeah. Um. So sweepers are categorized as Pokemon generally that require a lot of setup. This is supposed to be in wall breakers. Um. Yeah. Generally, is required a lot of setup. But once they set up, can do very devastating amounts of damage to boards, right? And they're called sweepers because their job is that after you've kind of fleshed your opponent's um, board out, you can set up with them and take over the game with them, basically, right? So, if you know anything about trading card games, you know that generally the way they're designing um, their formats right now is that they're um, designing a lot of archetypes that would be the equivalent of like wall breakers, or what we're gonna get into, um, or they're gonna get into. They're like generally wall breakers, or they're generally like very um kind of very focused meta Pokemon, right? Whereas like in Pokemon, right, your meta Pokemon can be something like, if you want to something like a Dragapult, for example. This is a physical Dragapult, but Dragapult can be built, special as well, right? It gets moves like Draco Meteor, Fire Blast, stuff like that. Something like Blaziken too, right? This is a physical Blaziken, right? And then I have a special Blaziken as well, right? But generally in card games where there's a lot more structure, you don't really have that much room for like being able to do something like that. So generally you get a lot of very you know, basically what boils down to control in formats, basically, right? And so yeah, um, in contrast to that, right? Generally, combo type Pokemon, which would be categorized as sweepers, um, in um the Pokemon game, right? Don't have that kind of freedom to be able to, be played in a lot of different styles, right? And if they do, it's either because, it's just like something they overlooked, or something that isn't really being accounted for, right? So yeah, just like in card games, Pokemon is no different, right? Pokemon generally doesn't have a lot of Pokemon that are categorized as very powerful sweepers right here, right? So like you can even see in this list, right? There's not really a Pokemon in here that you would look at and be like, yeah, man, this Pokemon has just been running over formats, right? Um, it's very hard for these Pokemon to function, and it's not because they're not good. It's just because, again, right, in a game as abstract as Pokemon, right, you're not going to be able to structure a format where these Pokemon can thrive well, even in an odds-based scenario, right? Um, which Pokemon has largely not become actually the game, right? Whereas the trading card game generally is pretty odds-based, right? Um, so yeah, um, it's not very common to be threatened by Pokemon that are sweepers, but they definitely exist, and they definitely are able to do things, basically, right? So yeah, that's sweepers, right? Um, and the last category is utility, right? So utility is again the category where you could go into a lot of different subcategories with them, but generally utility Pokemon are you know um you know um Pokemon that can do a lot of different things, right? So these are Pokemon that don't really fit into category of wall breakers or or what would be wall breakers. Another name to them, if you wanted to use a more philosophical term, is like glass cannons, right? Yeah, they don't really fit in that category of like glass cannon or like setup type Pokemon, which would be another term for like sweeper Pokemon, right? Utility Pokemon generally have another term for utility Pokemon would generally be like gimmick Pokemon, right? Pokemon that don't generally have a straightforward strategy that you want to lead into. It's just they um, basically can just do a lot of different things, right? So they can just fit on your team and fill a role that you need for whatever format that you're playing in, basically, right? They take a Pokemon like, in the earlier format, uh Murkrow was like the premier Pokemon that was setting up Tailwind, right? But like Murkrow is a pre-evolution Pokemon. At least it is now, right? In Gen 2 when it came out, it wasn't a pre-evolution Pokemon, but Murkrow is a pre-evolution Pokemon, right? So it's very odd to see it very popular in competitive formats, right? But with its ability, Tailwind, Prankster, right? Um, which gives it +1 priority to status moves, right? It can set up a Tailwind with priority, right? Which in set, A, B, etc. There weren't any Pokemon that could do that except for like Whimsicott, right? So yeah, Murkrow found its space in um, the competitive VGC format, right? Because of that reason, right? And so yeah, um, these are generally Pokemon, right, that don't really fit into a traditional category of Pokemon, and so therefore they're just classified as utility Pokemon, right? Or if you want to use a more colloquial term, like gimmick Pokemon, right? So yeah, not gonna get into like subcategories. Just want to kind of cover those four main categories, and yeah, sort of organize Pokemon into the categories that they fit into, right? So that it's understood that like I've been trying to explain in my um format deck profile videos for the format that we're currently in, which is Brilliant Stars to Prismatic Evolutions, right? That Pokemon isn't just trying to, they're not trying to make an anime, you know, um, right? Like, you take something like Yu-Gi-Oh, for example, where they have their anime in tandem with the game. Um, Pokemon is not trying to make an anime. Pokemon is a game first, right? And should be treated as such ultimately, right? So yeah, right. Like, so it's not necessarily something where you want to be like, yeah, right. You know, Hydreigon is like the most devastatingly scary, uh, you know, pseudo legendary, right? And then like Dragonite is like the cutest legendary, You can look at Pokemon like that, right? No problem with that, right? But Pokemon is a game first, right? And so, aesthetics aside, right? These Pokemon are supposed to be doing something, right? So that should be the number one priority ultimately of players, is what the Pokemon do, not what the Pokemon look like, or what partner Pokemon you know the main character of Pokemon has in the anime, right? So yeah, um, those are the general categories of Pokemon, and so just want to get into sort of the team I'm playing for VGC right now, which is and it's in the standard. I mean, not the standard format. It's in Set G. So Set G um, is um, in the basically you have one restricted Pokemon that you can use, right? Which are generally like box legendaries as they're called. Um, and then you have like Pokemon from different generations, right? So you can bring Pokemon over from home, and you can play them, in you know, um, you can play them in the standard in the set G format, right? So yeah, all the Pokemon you can bring from home, and then you can play one restricted legendary, right? So yeah, that's set G. So this is the team I'm playing for set G right now. Um, uh, so yeah, maybe I'll make another video about different categories of teams. I think that would be pretty interesting to look at. But yeah, uh, this is what would be categorized as a balanced team, basically, right? So, balance is generally categorized as a team doesn't really have like a very um, overpowered mechanic in it. It's Pokemon generally composed of usually meta Pokemon, a lot of meta Pokemon. Usually the core of the team is uh, a fire Pokemon, a grass Pokemon, and a water Pokemon, and then you know Pokemon that complement them basically, right? So yeah, this is like a balanced team that I'm playing right now for the set G. Um, season 28, I think we're in, um, or season 24. Um, and yeah, um, so the team's restricted is Rayquaza. Um, and yeah, Quaza is pretty interesting Pokemon. It's I would say got a lot of support over the generations. You know, if you're pretty familiar with like Gen 6, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, like singles, right? You're pretty familiar with like the controversy around Mega Rayquaza, right? So yeah, it's a Pokemon that's got a lot of support, and yeah, it's a pretty devastating Pokemon once it gets set up. Um, and yeah, even when it's just on the board, it just is a very big threat. And yeah, right? um, and Set G is again, Set G hasn't really been fleshed out that much, right? So it's not understood very well, kind of what role Pokemon play in Set G. Just kind of understood that you can play restricted, and restricted are pretty overpowered, right? So you just want to make the most powerful restricted Pokemon and sort of build around that, right? But there's definitely a lot more depth to Pokemon than just you know, playing Calyrex and just pressing a very overpowered spread move, right? So yeah, don't want to get too much into that, but yeah, I like Waza in Set G because um, if you're familiar with like Set H, which is the format that was before this one, you're pretty familiar with like normal Terra Dragonite. And Dragonite generally has been pretty prevalent in Scarlet Violet VGC formats. So it's not unfamiliar to be playing normal Terra Dragonite. But yeah, um Rayquaza I feel like is just a more overpowered version of normal Terra Dragonite. They're both dragon flying Pokemon that get extreme speed. And so, you know, what's better than having one dragon flying Pokemon with extreme speed on your team? Is having two, right? So that's generally the take um, that I'm trying to have with this team, right? So I play Dragonite. Rayquaza as my restricted, right? It has extreme speed, protect, Swords Dance, and then Dragon Ascent, right? And yeah, right. Dragon Ascent, pretty controversial move, right? 120 base power flying type move has the same drawback as close combat, and yeah, it requires a signature move, um, and yeah, it's a pretty devastating move, right? It's flying is a type that is a very strong. It's just a strong type in general, right? You have immunity to ground, which is a very strong type offensively, and then your um, resistance line, if you want to call it that, for types that resist you is very kind of meager, right? Generally, a lot of balance. A lot of like meta Pokemon don't really resist flying, and so Dragon Ascent is a very devastating move to have on your team, right? So I put Swords Dance with it, so that pretty much anything that's gonna hit with Dragon Ascent is taking like 75% at least, right? So yeah, that's kind of my angle with the Dragonite, with the Rayquaza, and it's an adamant nature, because since it has extreme speed, generally if I'm gonna attack, I'm probably going first, right? So yeah, I'm not gonna need Jolly, and also Rayquaza is not very popular Pokemon in Set G, so no reason to run a Jolly. I can just run it Adamant, and yeah, I'll get more value from having Adamant nature than a Jolly nature, right? So yeah, and it's 252 attack, 252 speed, right? And yeah, then there's the Dragonite, of course, I mentioned already. This guy, and yeah, the Rayquaza also has a Life Orb, right? Just to amplify it, extreme speed even more, right? So yeah, next is the Dragonite. Um, it's a Salt Vest Dragonite with multi skill, and basically, um, so yeah, if you're familiar with the Salt Vest, you know that what it does is increase your special defense by 50%, but your the Pokemon holding it can't use status moves. So you're restricted to having four attacking moves, but you have 50% more defense, right? And so, I feel like this item is very strong in Set G because restricted Pokemon, generally, have very high stat lines, so it's pretty important to have a Pokemon with a Fall Vest on your team. And yeah, Dragonite's also a pretty good meta Pokemon in VGC, so put those two together and you get a pretty strong meta Pokemon as a core of your team, right? And yeah, um, so Solvus Dragonite, Adamant Nature has 252 attack, 132 HP and then 124 special defense. Right, so just a split between HP special defense, prioritizing HP since generally its HP is going to be more important than its special defense. Right, then it has the attacks outrage, extreme speed, ice spinner, top enchanter. Right, so outrage. I think honestly I'll leave kind of my explanation of outrage for another video. But um, extreme speed, ice spinner, and stomp and tantrum are pretty standard moves to have on Dragonite. There's been a lot of different variations of Dragonite throughout Scarlet and Violet, but I feel like these moves are pretty effective for Set G to have on it, especially with a Assault Vest one. So yeah, extreme speed, obviously, no explanation there needed there. It's uh it's normal Terra, so you get a normal Terra extreme speed off, and that's gonna do a lot of damage, right? Ice Spinner, is just for like mirror matchups, for example, against other Dragon Pokemon, and also with like the prevalence of Pokemon like Indeedee, Rillaboom, Miraidon. Having Ice Spinner is pretty good slot, and then Stomp and Tantrum, right? Ground is a pretty good offensive type for an attack, right? So you're not going to want to use out Earthquake because then you're going to have to build around Earthquake. With a lot of Pokemon with like flying types and levitate and stuff like that, or resistance. And so yeah, you just run Stomp and Tantrum, right? So yeah, that's like the core of the team is Dragonite and Rayquaza. Then I build like a Fire Water Grass support, right? So I got Rillaboom, normal Terra, um, with a clear amulet. Um, and yeah, Rillaboom Pokemon that is pretty, popular in VGC, but people don't really, again, they don't really play the game, so they don't really understand what Rillaboom does. They just kind of put it on their team. It has good stats, has Grassy Surge, so Rillaboom, would be classified as like a meta Pokemon, and yeah, so this one isn't really like a gimmicky one. This one is just pretty straightforward. Um, you run Fake Out on it. This one's 252 HP, 252 attack, out of a nature. Um, and yeah, so you have this one has Wood Hammer, High Horsepower, Fake Out, and U-turn. Right. You want to run. Generally, you want to run. People kind of run it with like Grassy Glide, but honestly, with like Miraidon and Indeedee and stuff like that, putting a slot for a Grassy Glide feels pretty stupid, quite frankly. And so U-turn, I feel like, is a more effective move for like board control. And also, if you're up against like other Rillabooms and stuff like that, you can hit them for super effective damage, right? So yeah, that's Rillaboom. Um, Volcarona, I have on this team too. Um, the leftovers Volcarona, um, with Flame Body. Um, Volcarona is a very devastating Pokemon. Whatever format you're playing in, whether it be singles, doubles, you name it, Volcarona is just a very devastating Pokemon, right? So this one um, is a more bulky Volcarona. So it has 252 HP. Then it has 132 special attack, 124 special defense, and it's a modest nature, right? So it has the moves Bug Buzz, Heat Wave, um, Rage Powder, and Quiver Dance. And yeah, so this thing is more for like redirection, and it also can play a role as a sort of like a Gambit style Pokemon, where it can redirect and also play a role as a very good early game, um, a really good early game Pokemon, right? And a really good Pokemon to help support other Pokemon on the board, right? But yeah, that's kind of the goal with Volcarona on this team. And yeah, right. Next we got Lapras. This is Citrus Berry Lapras, Ground Terra. Um, so it's Lapras. I feel like is really good at set G because it has this one has a lot of ability to water absorb. So what it's going to be doing is basically like stopping a lot of like spread water moves, like water spout and stuff like that, and also providing a lot of utility with the moves it has. Right, so this one has Life Dew, Muddy Water, Thunderbolt, and Freeze Dry. So Freeze Dry is a very effective move in this format. I mean, yeah, it's a very effective move in this format. Because there's just a lot of very devastating dragon Pokemon and water Pokemon in the format. So having freeze dry just very effective for covering those Pokemon. Muddy water is a very strong spread move, probably like the best, spread move that spread water move that a lot of Pokemon have access to, right? And I feel like Lapras is a pretty good Pokemon to use it, because it's just a very strong. I would classify it as like a utility Pokemon, right? Um, so yeah, right. Um, and if you played a lot of like singles, you're familiar with like the ice lightning type combination for attack and how many types it covers. I think the only Pokemon that walls ice lightning is Lantern, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, um, not a lot of Pokemon that wall the ice lightning combo. So yeah, Lapras is just very powerful to have on this team as another threat, basically, right? Then the last Pokemon is Flutterman, right? With a booster energy, Fairy Terra. Um, and this one's 252 special attack, 252 speed, and it's is a timid nature, right? So basically, Flutterman doesn't really have an identity in this format. People haven't really been fleshing Flutterman out too much. But Flutterman, I feel like is very good Pokemon in this format because its stat line is very good. 135 special attack, 135 special defense, 135 speed. So, and on top of that, it's also a fairy type, right? So Pokemon like Miraidon, right, um, can't outspeed it unless it's under Tailwind, right? So add that to having like a Fairy Terra Dazzling Gleam, and you have a very devastating fairy Pokemon on your team, right? So this one has Dazzling Gleam, Shadow Ball, Mystical Fire, and Protect, right? So yeah, right. Balance is pretty uncommon in this format. People generally try to make a very overpowered team, very centered on one main strategy, right? And so you don't really get to see a lot of balanced teams. But I feel like balance is very important in VGC formats because it basically allows for teams to have to, you know, have a lot of options on their team, basically. Instead of just being like, yeah, I can just put five supports on my team and then put like a Shadow Rider Calyrex and I just press Astro Virage uh, two times or three times or something like that, right? So balance makes it so that you have to have a lot of options on your team. And so that's why I feel like I've gravitated a lot to balance. Um, and so yeah, that's why I like playing balance. And yeah, so probably gonna play this for the next season too. And yeah, probably refine this a little more. Probably build around full Corona a lot more. And yeah, this is my VGC team for Set G right now. And so yeah, um, kind of went over the EVs and the moves and stuff like that and the terrace. So if you want to, play this team yourself, welcome to, tinker with it. Move around a lot of stuff. And yeah, um, yeah. The last thing I want to get into, um, that I kind of already went over a little bit, is sort of my take on this game, right? Um, you know, even want to call it that. Honestly, this game is my life, so it's not really something that is kind of too groundbreaking or anything like that. But generally people who play Pokemon, they don't make their own Pokemon, right? There's a guy who covers making your own teams on YouTube. I'm a Blissey, right? And he, kind of highlights how grueling it is to make your own team and stuff like that. But that's like if you're starting from scratch, right? That's what he kind of covers on his videos. Um, but yeah, like this team I made, I already had this Pokemon. I had all these Pokemon already. So this team, I literally made it overnight, right? Once I came up with a concept, I literally made it overnight, right? So, you know, it's one thing to say, starting from scratch, it takes you whatever amount of time to make your team. But it's another thing if you play the game, you can just come up with a concept and just put it out, right? So yeah, um, ultimately, that's the stance I take, and um, don't want to, put myself on a pedestal or anything like that. But I feel like that's sort of the direction that players who play Pokemon should take, right? Um, I think it's a very unhealthy part of Pokemon community that um, VGC players don't even play the game; they just play VGC, and so the fact that you can just generate your team in a Pokemon generator um, basically makes it inaccessible for people who play the game like me to win because they've basically just focused mainly on pretty much getting money from the game instead of the continuity of the game, right? So that's basically what my contribution is all about. And yeah, I know there's people out there who also sing the same sentiments. So yeah, I know I'm not alone in this, but yeah, it'd be very nice if people were more honest, basically, about their role in the community, basically, right? So yeah, that's it for this video. Yeah, gonna be kind of formulating a lot more BGC content, and yeah, probably just make it a tandem with TCG content, and yeah, maybe I'll do some team um showcases for VGC, sort of like I do for TCG. Then maybe I'll do some like streaming and stuff like that for VGC because I feel like VGC is a lot better game to stream than TCG. So yeah, probably gonna do some VGC streaming rather. Maybe I'll do some VGC and TCG at the same time, right? Um, but yeah, uh, look forward to all that, and yeah, thank you for listening, and hope to see you in the next video.